Good morning, I'm Annie Larkin, Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Amerind Museum. Welcome to Traditional Ecological Knowledge, learning from Indigenous Practices for Environmental Sustainability with Professor Melissa K. Nelson. Before we begin the program today, I want to acknowledge that Amerind is located in southeastern Arizona, on lands where the O'odham, Hopi, Oshwe, and Apache families lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. Amerind would like to extend a special thank you to today's program sponsor, Arizona G&T Cooperatives. Their generous support has enabled Amerind to bring this free programming to our audience today. And thank you to our members and donors who enable Amerind to provide free online programming as well, and to fulfill Amerind's mission to promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist Amerind in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit amerind.org. On October 16th at 11 a.m. Arizona time, Amerind will host the free online artist talk, Under the Microscope, using process to develop visual voice with artist Deborah Edgerton. Edgerton's work is currently on display at Amerind in the multi-artist exhibition, Parched. Please visit the events section of Amerind's Facebook page or website, amerind.org, for the online program registration details. Autumn Fest is back and will be held Saturday, October 23rd from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. at the Amerind Museum in Dragoon. This year, Autumn Fest celebrates the history, culture, and arts of the Yoeme community with artists, public talks, and performers. For more information, visit the events section of Amerind's Facebook page or our website, amerind.org. Okay. Melissa K. Nelson joined the Arizona State University in August 2020. She is a professor of Indigenous Sustainability in the School of Sustainability. Dr. Nelson is an Indigenous ecologist, writer, editor, media maker, and scholar activist. Before joining the School of Sustainability, she served as a professor of American Indian Studies at San Francisco State University from 2002 to 2020. Specializing in Indigenous environmental and California Indian studies. Dr. Nelson is transdisciplinary and community-based scholar dedicated to Indigenous rights and sustainability, biocultural heritage and environmental justice, intercultural solidarity, and the renewal and celebration of community health and cultural arts. She actively advocates for Indigenous peoples' rights and sustainable lifeways in higher education, nonprofits, and philanthropy, and is particularly passionate about Indigenous food sovereignty at local, regional, and global levels. Dr. Nelson has led numerous community-based projects through her work at the Cultural Conservancy, an Indigenous-led organization which she has directed since 1993. She is Anishinaabe, Cree, Métis, Norwegian, and a proud member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. And if you would like to ask any questions during the program today, please be sure to type your questions into the Q&A chat box, and we'll gather those questions to share with our speaker after the presentation. And we are also recording today's program, and a link to the video will be sent out to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Melissa Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And I'm so honored to be a part of the Amerind's work and really appreciate your diverse programs and support for local tribal communities. So happy to be here. Bujun Indinwe Maganatugs, Tanshikia. I'm greeting you in the Indigenous languages of my ancestors, Anishinaabe and Cree. And I'm mixed race, Native person, as shared earlier, a proud member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe in North Dakota, where my mother was born and raised. And my father, my Norwegian farming father, was also from that area. I've spent most of my career in California, in the West Coast, but I'm very excited decided to come to the Arizona area, where I've worked with tribes and other groups for about 20-30 year period. So happy to be here. I also want to acknowledge the Salt River Maricopa Pima community here in the Salt River watershed, also known as Phoenix Valley, where I'm currently residing or spending time becoming a professor of sustainability at ASU, which is a wonderful new adventure. And without further ado, I want to share with you a bit of a presentation about the wonderful book, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, that I co-edited with Professor Emeritus Dan Schilling from ASU a couple of years ago. And it was an epic project that had a long history and origin story, and Amerind is part of that story. So I will start my show now. Excellent. Well, first, I want to let you know a little bit more about the places that I come from, because for Indigenous peoples, when we talk about traditional ecological knowledge, it's always about the land and the waters that we stand on, and the ancestors that we stand on, quite literally. Their bones are in the soil. So in the upper left here, that is a beautiful oak tree at the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Indian Reservation near Dunseith, North Dakota, where I still have stewardship over some ancestral lands. On the right is the beautiful South Fork of the Eel River, where I spent the first 18 years of my life growing up in Mendocino County in a beautiful small rural town. And over to the lower left is Marin County, Mount Tamalpais, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, where I've spent really the last 30 years of my life and have deep connections and home ties there with that community in Coast Miwok lands. And then the lower right, where I currently am at ASU. So these are some of the ecosystems and places and the ancestral lands that I am connected to. This book was an incredible project, and I really want to acknowledge Dan Schilling, who serves on the board of Amerind, for his leadership and role in crafting this beautiful book with me over about a 5-year period between 2013 and 2018, when it was published by Cambridge University Press. I love this cover and want to acknowledge the wonderful Karukirok and Hupa artist, Lynn Risling, who is an incredible artist, and her website is there. And this is an excerpt or a little short image of a larger painting called Bringing Back the Balance. And really, traditional ecological knowledge for Indigenous peoples is about bringing back the balance, because we are clearly out of balance within our ecological limits at the moment. And you'll hear me use a few different terms. Indigenous knowledge systems are kind of the larger, greater knowledge systems that I'll be discussing. And this is a term used by the United Nations and by a lot of global Indigenous communities to talk about kind of the scale of massive Indigenous knowledge systems about everything from astronomy to art, to cooking, to chemistry. And then within that is a subfield of Indigenous science, which really encompasses all of that and is just another way of saying it, but has some particular definitions that we'll get into. And then really another kind of subset or nested part of that is this concept of traditional ecological knowledge that really, after about 30 years of work and efforts by many of the contributors of the book, has finally caught attention by mainstream society and by Western academia and the scientific community. So some people still don't like the term, Indigenous peoples and others, and it's contested. It means many different things. There's no really one set definition, because TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, it even has its own acronym, which is always a sign of success in academia. It has course, many different meanings based on where it comes from. But for the purposes of this talk and this book, the word is here to stay. We embrace it. I embrace it. And it's a conversation, much like the term sustainability, which has become so widespread to be almost meaningless. As Dan Schilling writes in the first chapter, many people talk about sustainababble because it could mean anything. Coca-Cola has a sustainable this, or, Chevron has a sustainable that. And we don't really know what it means. So both of these terms, though, are here to stay. And we believe it's important to redefine Indigenous sustainability from our own worldviews and value systems. So the basic premise of the book, and all the contributors agree with this, is that Indigenous people's knowledge, and again, you cannot separate the knowledge from the people. And that's one of the critiques of the term, is it's kind of abstracted or extracted. And actually, traditional knowledge is completely about re-embedding in the intimacy with the landscape. It's not about extraction or abstraction. It's about embodying. And so Indigenous people's knowledge enhances, restores, and creates biocultural diversity, biological and cultural diversity. It also creates resilient ecosystems and sustainable communities. So that's kind of the overarching message of the book, told in many different ways from many different tribal traditions, languages, and landscapes. A little history and context of the book. I was very fortunate to be a visiting scholar at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe about a decade ago in 2011. And there I gave a talk on traditional ecological knowledge as part of my research, and met a wonderful man, Norm Yaffe, who was very, very interested in the topic and connected me with Chris Boone and Dan Schilling in the School of Sustainability at ASU and the book series on sustainability, and said, we really need a book really honoring the first sustainability scholars, Indigenous peoples. So that started a conversation really about a decade ago. And then Dan and I, with sponsorship from the School of Sustainability at ASU, were able to organize a scholar seminar at the Amerind Museum in 2013 and bring together about 15 of our 18 contributors for an in-person 4-day seminar to review drafts of each other's papers and give feedback and comments and take hikes and eat meals together and have late night conversations. And it was a wonderful experience. So I really thank all of these institutions for their role in helping to make this book project possible. And this is the lovely group that met there. Most of the contributors are in this image. You'll see from the left, the fabulous Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's become just an international rock star with her great book, Braiding Sweetgrass. We honor her and thank her for her wisdom and articulation of so many principles and speaking it in a way that has really caught the popular imagination. Joan McGregor, professor of philosophy at ASU, Kyle White, Potawatomi professor and philosopher in Michigan, a great practitioner and one of my early teachers, Dennis Martinez, with the headband, Tohono O'odham, Chicano, and Swedish. Before him, the award-winning poet and novelist, Linda Hogan. Next to her, the fabulous Yaqui law professor, Rebecca Sosi. Behind her, the wonderful Dan Schilling, Professor Emeritus from the English Department at ASU. And then we see the, again, award-winning poet and novelist and writer, Simon Ortiz. Behind him, ecologist Michael P. Nelson. Great work in long-term ecological research. And then before him, my dear soul sister, Priscilla Settee, professor of Indigenous Studies in Saskatoon, and then myself. We had a great time, as you can tell. And so in the book, there were 18 authors, including Dan and I as two editors who also contributed chapters. There were 10 women and 8 men. I wanted there to be a slight imbalance to really elevate and highlight Indigenous women's voices in this book. 14 of us come from Indigenous backgrounds, 4 Euro-American backgrounds. 10 Indigenous groups were represented, including 9 Native American tribes and 2 international groups, Priscilla Cree in Canada, and a constellation of wonderful Maori scholars from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tribal contributors range from Potawatomi in Michigan to Pueblo in New Mexico, Chickasaw in Oklahoma, and Yaqui in Arizona. Mainly all scholars with PhDs or honorary PhDs, but also a few wonderful practitioners, real field land care managers. And we really wanted the book to look at the deeper issues of TEK, the concepts, the ethics, how those feed into the practices, and how that feeds into law, both natural law or native law, and also Western law. So we close with a really powerful piece by Rebecca Sosi about the implications of traditional ecological knowledge in the international policy arena with protecting things like intellectual and cultural property rights. But the vast majority of the papers refer to what we call indigenous law or natural law and native concepts of original instructions. So we start with key concepts. We look at bedrock, kind of in the like an ecosystem. Everything comes from the earth, the stone. We move into the extended web of relationships with our plant and animals, and of course, sky and water and fire. And then we move into the global and legal implications. So that's a little bit of the setup. We wanted the book to follow kind of the spiral that for us is such an important icon for Indigenous peoples around the world. You find in petroglyphs and pictographs and on pottery designs and basket designs. And this is a wonderful spiral image that's based on a sacred water site in India. It is also the logo for the Cultural Conservancy, the organization I also work with, and also for SAR in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It really embodies the whole idea of as above, so below, and the interconnected of all things. And here we're honoring our first strawberries. And first strawberry ceremonies are important to many Native American communities to really honor the first fruits of the season as a sacred gift from Mother Earth and from the forest. So we believe and really try to demonstrate that TEK co-creates biocultural diversity and demonstrates symbiotic relationships in the world. Symbiotic relationships living together in a mutually beneficial way to really heal the relationship between nature and culture that has been broken since settler colonialism and other acts of colonialism and imperialism that have really broken this traditional relationship that so many cultures had. And of course, Native people made mistakes like all people. I'm not proposing the ecologically noble savage myth that Native people always lived in harmony with nature. Native people, like all people, overconsumed, made mistakes at times, and learned from those and encoded those in their stories and songs and practices. So TEK has the promise today to help heal the relationship between nature and culture, land and people, what we call the biosphere and the ethnosphere, between our ecosystems and our languages, between our species and our stories, and between our history and our future. And just to give a little bit of a definition of biocultural diversity, it's really what we often refer to as the web of life that includes the biological diversity that scientists today are so concerned with preserving and protecting and restoring in the conservation movement. That could be genetic diversity, species diversity, habitat diversity, ecosystem diversity, larger landscape level diversities, and then ultimately our biosphere. For cultural diversity, we know one of the best indicators and representations of cultural diversity are endemic languages. And there is a very profound correlation between endemic native plant species and endemic indigenous languages. But of course, those languages include lifeways, they include the worldviews and values and knowledge systems. And of course, they include the hands-on and embodied practices and ways of being. What Harvard anthropologist Wade Davis calls the ethnosphere. In addition to the biosphere, we have this whole ethnosphere, kind of an invisible sphere of ideas and languages and values from the world's cultures. And here's just some examples. I think agriculture and food and farming is one of the best examples of the relationship between biological and cultural diversity, because all communities have to live off of the land. And what is our relationships with the plants and animals and the diversity that natural ecosystems give to us, and to how does human tending and stewardship and management and guardianship of those plants and animals in composition, in abundance, really create two flourishing, sustainable societies. And here's a lovely picture from the award-winning author and photographer, Dr. Lois Ellen Frank, a culinary historian, really showing some of the wonderful iconic foods of the Southwest, with peaky bread from the Hopi and all the different colors of maize and corn and the hatch green chili and the peppers and the native chiltepines and all the wild harvested pinon pine nuts and cactus fruits. So this is such a wonderful representation of the Earth's biodiversity, but human tending and cultivation and coevolution over time with cultural diversity or biocultural diversity. And for Indigenous peoples, we live in storied landscapes and we live in moral landscapes, as Enrique Samon, the Raramuri ethnobiologist, talks about. And it's really humans' role to listen to the stories of the land, to listen to the lessons of the land. And we shared back to the land these stories and morals in rock art and in paintings, in dances, in the way that we have our seasonal cycles of honoring what the earth gives to us with the thunder beings, the storms coming in when the monsoon rains come in. These all are embodied in oral literatures for Indigenous peoples that have deep moral lessons within them. So again, one of our most important roles as humans is to be good listeners. And it's important because we can violate natural laws. And many of our stories talk about restraint, talk about making mistakes when we violate natural laws, when we don't listen to the natural world. One elder always says, nature always gives you a warning, you know, the rattlesnake with its little rattle, the storm clouds that you see in a distance, the way the birds act. So if you listen, you can know what's coming by really paying attention. And when we don't pay attention, there are often dire consequences. And here we see a mythical depiction of one of our Ojibwe water serpents in relationship to people. And our water serpent, we make prayers to, we make offerings to, and this is common all around the world. Louis Hina, a wonderful knowledge holder from Tasuki Pueblo down at the bottom, is also talking about a water serpent in the Rio Grande, and how important it is to honor that spirit whenever you go canoeing or swimming or fishing. Likewise, this large body of water on the upper right is Lake Titicaca down in the edge of Peru and Bolivia, where the native peoples there, Aymara and Quechua, also have very similar stories about respecting the power of water to heal, to cleanse, to nourish, but also to take life. And Greg Cajete, the wonderful Tiwa scholar from New Mexico, has this great phrase, the indigenous mind is rising. And he says the indigenous mind is rising along with the sustainability movement. They go hand in hand. Some people trace it back 50 years ago to the first Earth Day, when we saw that iconic image of our fragile, beautiful Mother Earth from the moon images. And really, it's been 50 years of in the environmental movement, working very hard to try to raise awareness about our precious and then limited environment and the need to be in more harmonious relationship. And Greg Cajete reminds us that Native science is rooted in and evolves from Native community. So there's always an emphasis on doing this together. It's not an individualistic practice at all. And that this community includes our human communities, our families, our extended families, our clans, our bands, our tribes, all of our humans, and the more than human. So all of those relations that give us life, the fire, the water, the sky, the air, the food, the plants, the fish, the animals, in a symbiotic process. So Native science is born of a lived and storied participation with a natural landscape and with a reality. And he believes, as we all do in the book, that the serious study of Indigenous perspectives of environmental relationships to land, plants, animals, and natural resources provides much needed models for understanding environmental sustainability as a working process. As the environmental movement, the conservation movement have arguably have 50 to 80 years, some say would go back to the transcendentalists or others historically. Things have gotten worse, unfortunately, since the Industrial Revolution. And as the late great environmental elder David Brower used to say, all we're doing is slowing down the rate at which things get worse, which is a fairly pessimistic perspective on things, but it's also true. Just look at carbon and climate right now. If we stop producing carbon, immediately right now globally, we would still see the impacts and effects of it for a long time. So it's important to have a paradigm shift in our approach to sustainability. And we feel that Indigenous people and really an Indigenous mindset can really help to transform our way of living. And this, again, they're not just lofty ideas. It's very much about embodied practice and having our hands in the land while reaching for the sky. And here is some embodied traditional ecological knowledge that we've been doing at the Cultural Conservancy through Indigenous agriculture and farming and tending the wild, as MCAT Anderson talks about, because many Native California Indian folks and other folks were not farmers. They didn't need to really farm because the biodiversity was so dynamic and so rich that they could gather and tend to and practice what some call an agroecology, where you're really basing it on in situ native plants and animals rather than taking it out of its place and cultivating it in farms or gardens. But we do both, and we embrace both, and we have to embrace all these strategies for food security and survival. And here we're planting row crops, but we also plant in traditional three sister mounds of corns, beans, and squash, and do that with prayer and offerings and ceremony and honoring all the different corn traditions of the Americas, from the Mayan to the Seneca to the Pueblo. And the Indigenous mind is rising all around the world, not just in Turtle Island, North America. It's rising in Hawaii with efforts to protect Mauna Kea. It's rising all throughout the Pacific, throughout the Americas, throughout Asia, where we often don't think of Indigenous peoples. I was fortunate to go to a Terra Madre gathering in northern Japan with the Ainu people hosting it. And they were finally recognized as an Indigenous peoples by the government of Japan in just 2019. So there's still a lot of work to recognize and acknowledge Indigenous peoples from the historical erasure that has happened. And Indigenous sustainability, we really see it as an embodied ethic and a survival strategy. I think every chapter in the book talks about this embodied ethic. And again, going back to Dan Schilling's first chapter, where he says sustainability is not a new idea. It has been around since people have been around because it's a survival strategy. Indigenous peoples have been sustaining their cultures for thousands of years before colonization. We know the oldest living culture, Australian Aboriginal peoples, have persisted for more than 75,000 years. It's incredible. And there was some exciting new evidence some of you may have read in the New York Times a few days ago from White Sands National Monument, just next door to in New Mexico. There's been human footprints shown there, whole families, children, elders, they've indicated that were there at least 23,000 years ago. It's really flying in the face of the theories of the peopling of the Americas, and that we need to re-examine that. And Greg Cajete shares further that the perspective of Native science that are being voiced by Indigenous peoples have great potential for developing insight and guidance for the creation of the kind of environmental ethics and deep understanding that must be gained in the critical times ahead. And this is a couple of dear beloved sisters or relatives who are planting Seneca white corn. And this is showing this embodied ethic. We don't just dig a hole and throw the seed in. We take our time to speak to the seed, to pray to the seed. Seeds are ancestors for us. They're living embodiments of creation. As so many have said, the great Rowan White, a Mohawk seed keeper. And it's so important to embody that ethic and give value to the foods that we cherish as sacred foods and first foods. And again, TEK is embodied in things that we often call cultural arts, much like the different practices I know that Amerind focuses on, with honoring traditional knowledge holders and wisdom keepers and artists. Here we see traditional wood carvers, Polynesian wood carvers, California Indian basket weavers and dancers, and all of the regalia, all of the symbols, all of the materials that go into this are imbued with traditional ecological knowledge and an embodied ethic, an honorable harvest, as Robin Kimmerer talks about, in terms of how you harvest these materials and build them and create them for cultural expression. And one of the most beautiful sections of the book, but it's all extraordinary. You have to get it. I could only touch on a little part of it. It's so deep and so much knowledge, layers of knowledge. But one of the overarching messages in the book from all the contributors is that cultures of gratitude lead to cultures of reciprocity. Such a beautiful way of thinking about culture. And Robin reiterates that our oldest teachings remind us that gratitude is the thread that binds us together. Gratitude for family, for the breath of life, for the waters of life, for our food, for our shelter, and that gratitude is essential. The expression of gratitude may be emotional and spiritual, but it also engenders very practical outcomes with adaptive, evolved survival values. The practice of gratitude, for example, can lead to the practice of self-restraint, taking only what you need, leaving something there for others and for the animals. When we farm, we know that 10%, maybe even 20% some years will go to the animals, and we expect that. It's not that the animals are taking away from us. It's that we have to share with all of life. So self-restraint and avoiding exploitation and knowing that you have to share the food. So Robin shares this provocative question with all of us. How do cultures engage in reciprocity with the more than human world? And how do we give back in return for the gifts of the earth? And there's many different ways that Indigenous peoples return that gift. And that's what our ceremonial life is often about. But what can we do as modern Americans, living this high-tech world? How can we return also the gifts of Earth every day? And again, seeds are such important indicators of the gifts of the earth. If you ever look at even one, plum tree or one tomato plant that does well, right? There's so much food that it gives. And seeds, when there's a good year, gives so much, more than enough, right? And more than enough is another kind of tenet of the honorable harvest. And to know when enough is enough, we will always have enough. And so seeds are great teachers of generosity, and that act of every cycle, tending to one single seed that produces so many and then sharing it with your community and to produce another crop for the next year. Another important lesson of the book is really bringing traditional ecological knowledge into the Western sciences in a knowledge symbiosis. And one of the most obvious ways to do that is through the field of ecological restoration, which is a wonderful field. Not only do we have to protect lands from being ravaged or damaged or extracted or polluted, we also need to actively restore the lands that have been damaged through extraction or exploitation or any kind of pollution through bioremediation, phytoremediation, mycoremediation. There's wonderful research being done how to clean up toxic waste and other damaged areas. So Robin proposes that ecological restoration plus traditional ecological knowledge equals a new kind of reciprocal restoration. We know that native plant restoration can be enhanced by the traditional knowledge of basket weavers, of gardeners, of traditional herbalists and medicine people who really have a very different understanding of those relationships with those plants and can help create wonderful and long-lasting ecosystem restoration plans. Reciprocal restoration can support new directions in the burgeoning field of restoration ecology. The United Nations just declared the year of restoration ecology. Reciprocal restoration can serve to heal the land and our broken relationship to the land. One thing wonderful about restoration ecology, as opposed to classic preservation or conservation, is that humans have to be in the land. We have to be taking out those invasive species, planting those native species, helping to rechannel and daylight creeks and watersheds. So we become active participatory agents in ecosystem processes again. Reciprocally restoring is the mutually reinforcing restoration of land and culture, such that the repair of ecosystem services contributes to our cultural revitalization and the renewal of culture promotes restoration of ecological integrity. I think that is such a key definition of reciprocity and why it's so important to bring TEK into this field and really the exciting promise of it. I've experimented with this in the Presidio National Park in San Francisco with restoring a traditional creek, one of the last springs in San Francisco, undiverted springs that flows into the Crissy Field salt marsh. There was once a toxic army field base that has been restored into a beautiful wetland and estuary. So I've seen over a 20-year period with my own hands and eyes and bringing students out to engage in this kind of habitat restoration with the local Ohlone people and selecting the culturally significant native plants that were important to them in the process. How beautiful and how successful it can be. And again, we take youth out to gather traditional plants. This is a tule plant that is so important for Native California Indian communities to create everything from beds to boats to baskets. And it's so wonderful to be in a freshwater marsh on a warm summer day. They're not as hot as they are here, to gather together and to weave these into beautiful materials later. So much learning happens in this place-based embodied learning. So we know that plants are teachers. As Robin Kimmerer reminds us, plants are persons in Indigenous worldviews, and they are our oldest teachers. She has this great quote: plants know how to turn air and light into food and medicine, and then they give it away. Can humans do that? I don't think so, right? What an incredible opportunity and gift that plants give us through their photosynthesis. They unite earth and sky. They heal the land and feed all of creation. They create medicines. They teach us about working together in symbiosis. And they exemplify, again, the virtues of generosity. And here's an example of tending the wild with California tule, also called bulrush in California wetlands, and then making beautiful baskets out of them and tule boats to take out on the bay. And again, seeds are such a reminder of the generosity of plants and plants as teachers. Getting on to Dennis Martinez's wonderful chapter, he wants to redefine sustainability through what he calls a kin-centric ecology. And this is a term that he and Enrique Simon started working with really 20 years ago or more through the Ecological Society of America, and proposing a kin-centric relationship between humans and nature, not one that is anthropocentric, only human-centered, or that is biocentric, only nature-centered without humans, but one that is relationship-centered. It honors the evolutionary cultural heritage of Indigenous peoples and our relationships, which we all have sayings, all are my relations. And when we say that, we mean it. The Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people have really gifted the world with Motakwiyas, and all my relations is such an important way of recognizing that we are connected to everything. And it's encoded in our original instructions, or what is often called our treaties with creation, that are specific to specific peoples, specific places, and specific plants. And what Dennis Martinez also calls the original compacts made between animals and humans. For example, the Karuk and Yurok people with salmon up in the North Coast and all throughout the Pacific Northwest. There are profound and deep stories that the people have from their original instructions about these relationships with salmon. And it's even deeper than just two. It's not just a dyad. It's not just between people and salmon. It's between the river, and it's often with the bears, and it's also with the forest. And so that kind of whole kinship relationship, there's many different moving parts, what ecologists would call trophic levels. But we have, again, moral responsibilities to how all those different relatives interact within this ecosystem. So kin-centric relationships have evolved over time to what Western peoples often today called ethics. Again, an emphasis on that. Ethics is a code, a model, and standards that guide or regulate our behaviors with the natural world. And Jeanette Armstrong, one of my sheroes, an Okanagan leader from inland British Columbia, the Silex people, her chapter is so profound, talking about this kinship and this compact between her people and the plants and the fish and the animals in that area. Very profound understanding of the governance systems and how that ties to governance in leadership in your tribe. And we talk about not only the plants and animals, things that we can really see and touch on a daily basis as relatives, but we talk about the elements. And one that has really been given a bad name since really conservation and Smokey the Bear and the U.S. Department of Ag's, the Forest Service, they do a lot of good, but the whole idea of treating fire as an enemy that must be suppressed at all costs has come back to bite us now, as we've seen with these horrific forest fires. So traditional ecological knowledge is also about reconnecting to fire as a land care practice, a resource management practice, and even as a medicine. Again, fire can heal the people, fire can heal the land. There's many benefits to fire when it is slow and low and cool and not catastrophic and disastrous like we've seen it so out of balance recently in the West with these devastating fires. And I'm so sorry for all the people and their homes and communities and animals and plants that have suffered from these devastating fires. But to me, it's a sign again that Mother Earth is telling us we're out of balance and need to reconnect with all the elements, but fire especially, in a more balanced way. And just again, some other symbols of the use of fire. You know, fire helps create traditional pottery for the Pueblo community. Fire is used to create deer grass and other culturally significant plants used for basket weavers. The symbols of fire in different cultures, it's a sacred element tied to creation. Fire is used to clean fields after farming. So fire is an agent that is important to all cultures in different ways. And again, the importance of community and getting out on the land. TEK is about that embodied field place-based experience of reconnecting and getting out of the classroom, which is one of my favorite things to do with my students, go on field trips to tribal lands to learn directly from knowledge holders. Priscilla Sette's wonderful chapter on food sovereignty talks about how TEK creates agrobiodiversity and food sovereignty for Indigenous peoples. And sadly, the impacts of colonization, whether it's damming of the rivers, over harvesting of our buffalo, just there's so many impacts that have really inhibited our food security, our access to our traditional gathering sites and our farms. And so there's great need to restore our traditional agrobiodiversity and food sovereignty today. And Priscilla Sette's extraordinary chapter dives deep into the wealth of native foods of Turtle Island pre-contact, the horrific impacts post-contact, and efforts for revitalization today. And here's just one example from California with our beautiful tan oak gathering and then turning it into delicious foods. And this is the work of the Ohlone Cafe, an urban permanent pop-up cafe by the wonderful Vince and Lewis. You can find out more about them at Acorn Cafe. Pardon me, Ohlone Cafe. And getting close to conclusion here, one of the most important messages of our TEK book is that we have to move forward. Many people, critics will say, oh, TEK was all in the past and, you know, we can't go back. We agree, we can't go back. We don't want to go back. We want to move forward together in a knowledge symbiosis that honors the ethical values of traditional ecological knowledge, as well as the great values of many of the Western sciences. And Robin Kimmerer offers a beautiful metaphor of the three sisters of Native American agriculture, corns, beans, and squash. That corn really represents native science and traditional ecological knowledge, deeply rooted in the ground, reaching for the sky, very prolific, and a strong scaffolding, if you will, that really strong ethical code of conduct. She says beans is represented by Western sciences. Beans crawl all over the place. Beans are very curious, like the Western mind that wants to discover and uncover, and maybe doesn't always practice the precautionary principle, and maybe leaps before it explores the implications and the impacts on 7 generations in the future with some of our activities, such as genetic modification or artificial intelligence. What are the long-term implications of this? So Robin proposes that Western science, like the beans, has to be framed around the ethics of traditional ecological knowledge. And then she refers to the beautiful squash on the ground, close to the ground, that really provides this ethical space of engagement for us to connect in, and for us to find shade and shelter under, that keeps moisture in as these knowledge systems come together in a symbiotic way. We must work together in respect and reciprocity. This will take time for dialogue to collaborate and find common ground, to create a vision and a practice of life that is sustainable for all. Some other concluding thoughts: Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge as embodied by native practices on the ground today, not just in the past. They co-create with the natural cycles to create biocultural diversity and resilience. TEK listens to and is in conversation with storied and moral landscapes, is an embodied ethic that creates survival strategies, is rooted in kin-centric ecology and practices of gratitude, that engenders reciprocity, which contributes to restoration and healing of the land and of the people. It creates food diversity and food sovereignty for all. It contributes to a knowledge symbiosis to create greater options and solutions to address our pressing global crises. And it embodies a relational, participatory, and intimate ethic for a sacred life. So thank you for listening, and I appreciate your interest in this topic and look forward to some questions and answers. Chimigwech.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for a fantastic program today. We do have questions. The first is, what advice from Native communities can we apply to the climate change crisis?
Such an important question. The climate crisis we see is a symptom, not a cause of problems, right? The climate crisis is a symptom of living out of balance for not that long, a couple hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, and our over reliance on chemicals to create things that has put us, our atmosphere, out of balance with 350 parts per million of carbon. We are past that threshold with chlorofluorocarbons and ozone depletion. So we acted very quickly with the Industrial Revolution and didn't really understand the long-term implications or practice the precautionary principle. So we are seeing symptoms of a life out of balance for a couple hundred years, and there aren't going to be any silver bullets or quick fixes for climate change today. It doesn't mean there's not something we can do right now to stop using fossil fuels, to keep it in the ground, as many indigenous peoples in South America talk about, because oil is the life all over the earth. Indigenous peoples sit on land that hold fossil fuels, and people want to protect that and keep the lifeblood of Mother Earth in the ground and resist extractive industries that want to keep mining it. So those are some of the political and environmental justice implications of this work. But there are things that we can do every day to minimize our consumption of water, of materials, of the foods we eat. Every day we have an opportunity to contribute to healing the climate crisis. But we have surpassed many tipping points and planetary boundaries already. And as the great Kyle White talks about, who has an amazing chapter in the book, that is a little bit more critical of how Western science and academia is using TEK. But he has written recently, it may be too late for doing something about climate change, because we have surpassed relational tipping points, meaning those compacts with the plants and the animals and with water and fire, our compacts with the sky, were broken quite a while ago and continue to be broken. And how do we heal those relations with the sky again and with the waters? Those are profound moral and ethical questions. And many of us feel that we believe in technological fixes have a role, scientific fixes have a role, economic transformations have a role in the solution to climate change. And TEK has answers or suggestions for how to address all of those: technology, science, and economics. But at root, we need to get to the root causes and root solutions, which is really a paradigm shift in the way we think, in the way we operate, and the way we act with each other and with Mother Earth. And that's going to take quite a transformation. But it's happening in pockets and small communities all around the world from the grassroots. It's also happening with some policy and legal changes as well. So you asked a really important question, and Native peoples do have a lot of advice for this, and you have to look at your local area. Advice for, South Dakota is going to be different for advice in Northern Arizona. It's going to be different for the advice in the forests of Northern California, which is going to be different for the advice of the Pacific Islands with the small island nations. So you have to look very regionally and very locally.
How do you see regenerative agriculture connecting with TEK?
Great question. Well, really, I am so excited about all of the different reinventions of traditional ecological knowledge through Western cultural creations in agriculture, permaculture, regenerative agriculture, polycultures, carbon sequestering. It's really fantastic that so many in the regenerative agriculture field are kind of coming to their own conclusions about the importance of feeding back to the soil and to the water and to the plants and to the seeds that gives us agriculture. So I think there is great promise in more dialogue and conversations between Indigenous farmers and regenerative agriculturalists, as well as permaculturalists, and all the different agroecology fields that are popping up all over. Again, you have to look at place-based regional examples, but traditional ecological knowledge has been rooted in the concept of regenerative agriculture and agroecology by practicing the honorable harvest, never taking more than you need, giving always something back, replenishing from the system that you take from. So I think there's a lot of fertile ground to create some new exciting solutions to our food issues today with that field.
Would you explain and elaborate on the precautionary principle?
Yes, the precautionary principle is really supported by a lot of folks in the environmental justice movement, in the environmental justice fields. It's also been really supported through environmental legal conversations and strategies. The precautionary principle is really kind of based on an indigenous principle of the law of 7 generations. When you think of your action, whether you're going to build a new garage in your house, or something very practical, or you're going to buy food from the farmer's market, or you're going to buy food at Costco, or wherever you do something, what is the impact of your purchases, your consumption, your decisions to create something, consume something, or build something? What will be the impacts 7 generations ahead of you on that material, the plastic it came in, all the different people who produced it, distributed it, transported it, what is the impact? And so there's really different ways to measure that with, measuring your carbon footprint and understanding those long-term impacts. So the precautionary principle is about caution, slowing down, really looking systemically and holistically at the impacts of your decisions for the future, and not just on the human community, but on the planet. And so the precautionary principle is another example of, environmental justice activists from many different communities of color and their environmental attorney allies coming up with this idea of the impacts of siting a coal burning plant or siting a toxic dump site. Where are you going to put it? And what are the long-term impacts? And what is it going to be stored in? So it just is about slowing down and practicing more precaution in the way we do things.
How can settlers use TEK, keeping in mind how appropriation affects Indigenous communities and peoples?
Yes, you guys are asking great questions. This is a really big debate and discussion. We could have a whole session on it. I think, let's see how to start. Indigenous peoples are very diverse. I do not speak for all Indigenous people. I just speak for myself, and you're going to get different answers. I would say I can speak for the 18 Indigenous contributors to our TEK book, all feel that we are in such a dire ecological crisis right now that even though there is a danger sometimes of appropriation of some of our traditional ecological knowledge, it is more important to be generous, like the plants, like the seeds, and share our knowledge with settlers so that we can find solutions and survive. It's down to survival for the human species. Mother Earth is going to be fine. She's going to, maybe brush us off with some floods and fires, but she's going to persist. But the human species, like many other species that are tragically going extinct right now, we don't know. So we meaning the group in the book, feel it's time to be generous with our knowledge, to be able to find some of these solutions. Other Indigenous peoples feel that, and there's different layers of knowledge. We're not going to be sharing sacred knowledge, ceremonial knowledge, private knowledge that is only for our tribes, our nations, or our clans, or our ceremonial leaders. So there's layers of knowledge. Those nested knowledge systems are referred to. So we have to be very protective of that. But knowledge that can help us restore a river, restore a forest, build resilience in our agricultural systems, help sequester carbon. Those are all important bits of knowledge that we are happy to share in a reciprocal way, in a respectful way. So that's a big topic, and I wish I had more time to go into it with you, but thank you for that question. There's a lot of authors, Native people, talking about the protection of Indigenous knowledge against appropriation. And Rebecca Sosie's chapter in the book really touches on that as well in a very excellent way. So buy the book and you'll find out more.
And to remind our audience, the title of the book is Traditional Ecological Knowledge, Learning from Indigenous Practices for Environmental Sustainability. Thank you so much for joining us today, Melissa. It's been a fabulous presentation. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us today.
I appreciate the opportunity and all the good work that Amerind does, and all of you for joining us. And I'd love to see the questions later so I can at least look at them. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you again. And thanks again to our sponsor, Arizona G&T Cooperatives, for making this online program free for our audience. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a lovely day. Bye.